Hvick225, a player who built himself a legacy that still remains as one of the most impressive out of any player to ever touch the game, the pioneer of a playstyle, and the bringer and end cap on one of the game's greatest eras, having multiple points where he had a lead so big that he stopped feeling the need to try, and in the process he became a legend who seemed unstoppable, until one day he just disappeared. Who was Hvick? And what happened to him? We're going to begin in late 2013. To give a perspective of how long ago this was, PPV2 was not yet implemented, and most of the current top 10 hadn't even installed the game. And Hvick was already one of the best players, with an FC on the another difficulty of Freedom Dive being one of his top plays. But he still wasn't quite the best, since, literally just Kakizi was already getting good runs on 4 dimensions. This isn't quite a fair comparison though, since DT was very obviously his main mod, and he was already almost certainly one of the best at it, with many of the scores he had at the time still being high leaderboard spots even 8 years later. This made him one of the best in the entire game. But things really only start to get exceptional after one thing: the implementation of PPV2. Because he was placed at number 6 when it was first implemented, right behind Sayonara Bai, Galua, Wobbleful, Ferrucci, and Dungeon, which seemed to be a position he was determined to change, because after barely playing for nearly 3 months before May of 2014, he would transform into an entirely different caliber of player. Bam! In a single week, from 300 PP to 500. And keep in mind that he was already number 6 before this. This meant that this took him from a very skilled DT player to one who was so far out of nearly everyone else's reach that it was comical. But crazily enough, this insane lead he had in skill would only last for a week because of one player, Sayonara Bai. Because in a pretty nuts turn of events, both players would transform into gods in the same month. Sayonara Bai was already the number 4 spot, and so Hvick had some catching up to do. Luckily, since he had a 1-week head start, he would get within 1 rank of him. It would quickly become clear just how insignificant that was though, when Sayonara got a gimme gimme gimme, Shotgun Senorita, and Chase the Light FC, which brought him to the number 2 spot and gave him a nearly 800 PP lead over Hvick, which once again turned out to hardly matter, since Hvick would snap back with a good run on Shotgun Senorita, and then an FC on Hoshizora no Ima, which brought them to within 100 PP. But the thing was that Hvick just didn't stop, sitting number 1 after number 1 and getting so many 400s that he passed Sayonara by a whole 4 PP. Yeah, not exactly a substantial lead, and one that would be smashed within a few days, when Sayonara not only passed Hvick, but also Ruchi to take the number 1 spot. He did this through one main skill set, and that was his burst skill. Because while Hvick was very good at burst, and probably a bit better at aim, Sayonara Bai was a different kind of good, with his burst heavy scores not being matched in accuracy for the next 3 or 4 years. This also means that when looking at current PP, where speed has been thoroughly buffed, he would be number 1 by a long shot at the time. I say at the time, because Hvick would show that he had only really just begun. Because in August of 2014, he would get the PP record with this. He also gained 600 total PP, and passed Sayonara Bai to become the number 1 player. Obviously, these two players were competing for the number 1 spot, but in the process, they had both gotten stupidly good overall, and in general, this is one of the fastest times for overall player improvement. But sadly, it wouldn't last forever, since Sayonara Bai would be enlisted into the Korean military in early 2015, greatly reducing the amount of time he had to play the game. But this would also coincide with Wobbleful popping off on Hard Rock and taking the number 1 spot by a pretty large margin, which would keep Hvick occupied for about a week and a half. Yep, he didn't just set a bunch more 400s or anything. He took the PP record twice. First with a 530 on A and Friends, and then a 560 on 7-7. After getting these scores and taking back the number 1 spot, it became clear that Hvick was one thing, probably the most cliched attribute to give to older players. He was ahead of his time. But despite its overuse, I think this is really the only way to describe it. When his own 560 PP play was a PP record, he was still able to get multiple 500s in a week. He was legitimately uncontested, with reaching the number 1 spot equating to playing less than 1,000 times a month. And despite this, he was able to get a 500 PP lead overall, and become the first player to reach 10,000 PP. Basically, while being surrounded by hard rock players in the top 10, he had made DT not only viable, but the meta. And finally, after spending nearly an entire year ahead by a huge margin, there was finally one player who would contest him. Probably the fastest improving player ever at the time, Rafis. Another DT player who could finally rival him. Right? Well, only sort of. Because although Rafis would be able to make the gap closer and become the second player to reach 10,000 PP, this is really only enabled by Hvick's relative inactivity. But as time went on, Rafis not only got closer in rank, but he also got a lot better. And he actually began to start to catch up to Hvick in skill. Well, the Hvick that everyone had seen so far. Because despite playing very little, there was 1 month where he decided to come back and show exactly what he was made of, when it got him Mirai's UFC, worth 665 PP. This was the PP record by a wide margin, and it showed just how good he still was. But he'd go back to playing very little in August, September, and October, and Rafis just kept getting closer and closer, until one day he passed Hvick in rank. This also coincided with Rafis taking the PP record from him by 1 PP, which seemed to sort of usher in a new era, the end of the Hvick era, and the start of a Rafis one. Well, that is until Hvick smashed the lead that Rafis had in less than a week, with a rally-go-round SS. This would begin a very long cat-and-mouse game between Rafis and Hvick, which would only get crazier as time went on, with one good example being when Rafis passed Hvick for a single day, and then Hvick took back the number 1 spot with over 5 500s. And going into 2016, things seemed to be basically the same, with an intense but kind of half-hearted battle between Rafis and Hvick. Until it happened. Yeah, you probably know what I'm talking about right now. Hakizi, greatest player, unbanned. Yeah, he was very cool and all that. But him coming back also had a ripple effect on the 2 players who were already duking it out at the top, with Hvick using it as an opportunity to get as far ahead as possible before Hakizi had a chance to catch up. And through an asymmetry, Stellar Reum, and Magic 600, he was able to become the first player to reach 12,000 PP. He would then set his top play on Dream Soulster as well. This also would have been his 4th time to take the PP record, if not for Hakizi taking it 2 months earlier with Blue Zenith. This proved that despite how little he'd been playing the game, he was still a dominant force. But then, immediately after this show of immense skill and continued dominance over his category, he slipped away. This would leave a massive hole at the top level for DT. But as time went on, and much of 2016 passed, Rafis just kept getting better and better, until he had been able to fill that void. And it basically seemed like the era that was started with Rafis' PP record had finally come to fruition, and Hvick had just moved away from the game. But, come October, he came back for one final hurrah. He gained nearly 200 net PP in just 2 days, while having over 1,000 spectators, showing that he was still not only able to just compete with the top level, but maybe even surpass it. And it seemed like if he had kept grinding, he almost certainly could have made it to number 1. And then, he was gone. This time for good. So where did he go? Well, as for why he left, it's all hearsay. But apparently he started experiencing extreme input lag, and the time it took to get it fixed, combined with his already waning interest in the game, caused him to just never come back. And as for where he went, no one really knows, but it seems that he's probably just moved on from the game. But his legacy still remains as one that was so ahead of his time that it's shocking. This meant that most of his scores were basically unsnipeable, at least for a few years, which is why his presence was so missed. But after a very long time, some players had an idea. Why don't we finally prove that Hvick isn't better than the community now? And so, the idea of sniping every Hvick #1 was put into action. And through the efforts of much of the top 10, he went from 160 to just 60 #1 scores in November of 2018. And then, by a single month later, he had 13 left. There are now only 5, which does at least give sort of a sense of finality to the whole Hvick saga. And although he logs on every once in a while to play with friends in a multi and create a bunch of hype, it really seems like he probably isn't coming back.